This is Impolitic. Welcome to Impolitic, a show dedicated to friendly conversations between a libertarian, that's me, Paul Matsko,
and a socialist, that is me, Sean Trainer. Paul, guess what?
What's that?
I'm moving up in the world. I'm a real deal podcaster now. I have replaced the baby mic that you're still using with this Yeti mic.
Look at that.
So it's I don't know if anybody's noticing a difference in my sound quality, but if you are, it's because I've upgraded. Moving on up.
This is such a classic Bernie Sanders fan move, to be like, down with capitalism, but look at my awesome fancy mic provided to you by capitalism. The hypocrisy, Sean.
Or provided by workers. Who knows?
That's right. That's
right. So that's obviously the most important news, the fact that there's probably a great leap forward in audio quality this week. But also me and Paul, we are now, I would say about 45-50% resistant to COVID-19 as a show, because I now have full Johnson & Johnson immunity.
Nice.
Which again it's like 80 something, whatever. But and Paul, you just got your first shot. So
I'm half Moderna. The lady in front of me at the line. I love how we're like separating into, it's almost like the late antiquity when people separate into like what chariot team in Byzantium they cheered for. Like, I'm a red, I'm a green. And the lady in front of me said, was arguing with the pharmacist at the Walmart, poor beleaguered pharmacist, and being like, I don't want Moderna, I want Pfizer, god damn it. And
why? Who cares?
I know. It cracked me up because they're both mRNA vaccines.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they're very similar tech. It's not like I could get someone wanting like a Johnson & Johnson because they're suspicious of mRNA. But even Johnson & Johnson uses viral vector, which is a new tech. Anyways. But no, it was they were Pfizer partisans. What can I say?
Yeah, I mean, like when I was at the FEMA site where I got vaccinated about a month ago, you had a choice between J&J and Pfizer, and Ellen and I chose J&J because we had to drive an hour and a half to get up to Jacksonville, and we figured whatever, let's just get it done. And also figured at that time vaccines were a little bit more scarce, and it seemed like Johnson & Johnson provided us as younger folks with good protection against death and hospitalization, which, believe it or not, those are the two things I'm most concerned about. And leave some of the mRNA ones for the older folks, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I understand people having opinions about one versus the other there, but with Moderna and Pfizer, the difference in terms of immunity levels is minuscule, right? And it's basically the same technology. I don't get it, Paul, but I do understand that in some of the seemingly more normie corners of the internet, that folks are getting really invested in their vaccine team. Yeah. Like I saw somebody, and again, you never know whether this is actually something that people talk about or whether this is just like an op to make you think that people are weird. But I did see that post where it's like, Pfizer is Hufflepuff, and Moderna is Ravenclaw, and Johnson & Johnson is whatever the other one, Gryffindor, and AstraZeneca Slytherin. Or something. Like,
nice.
What the fuck are you talking? Like, what does this have to do with anything? I don't get it.
The whole well, I mean, that's the conversation about AstraZeneca and they basically didn't try to play nicely with the regulator, and as a result, there's all this breakdown of trust between them and the European Medicines Agency. But then at the same time, so it's funny because usually I am someone who, libertarians are big on the reciprocity train when it comes to drug regulation, that basically if one or two, the proposals vary, but there are multiple global versions of the FDA. There's the European Medicines Agency for the EU. There's a very prominent, well-regarded one in Japan. That if some proportion, if one or two of the world's major, pharmaceutical regulators approves a new drug, then other countries should give at least temporary authorization or speed the process up somehow for approval in their country. Because And the European Medicines Agency is usually one of those.
Yeah.
But the way they have handled the AstraZeneca complaints about the clots has been just remarkably bad, because basically they've said, like, our science is clear. Your risk of having a blood clot after taking the AstraZeneca vaccine are not higher than if you hadn't had the vaccine. Like, there's always, everyone has some chance of getting a blood clot, just period. Now, it does appear there's something there, that there is a very small, rare like interaction between the AstraZeneca drug that it does raise the risk, but we're talking about a minuscule amount for a very specific, set of people, a very small set of people. Like, so small, like, this is not a reason to literally hold up the distribution of the vaccine in multiple countries.
Yeah,
which is what
especially when the vaccine is protecting people from something that definitely causes blood clots, along with many other complications.
Yes. And so it's just typical, bureaucratic risk aversion, where the basic problem with medical regulation is that if you're the bureaucratic regulator, no one gives you credit if you approve a thing that works out. They only give you shit if you approve a thing that doesn't work.
Right.
There's no upside benefit really to rapidly approving life-saving medicine. There's only a shit storm that pours on you if you approve something bad. So the bureaucratic mindset is risk averse. We want zero risk, approach zero as much as possible, without thinking about the fact that the longer we take, that risk aversion itself can kill people. So this is our standard, talk around the water cooler at Cato. Every policy silo likes to debate whose policy silo is responsible for more preventable deaths. So most years it's the foreign policy team, because they're like, hey, look, American empire kills this number of many people. But man, the FDA really, they're still number one in the position, because if you just look at some of these drugs that take, the typical vaccine approval is 10 years. 10 years. And for non-vaccines, vaccines are particularly long, but for non-vaccines, it's still like 6, 7, 8 years on average. And you'll have these drugs that are approved in Europe or in Japan that start saving lives. And it's like 5 years later, the US finally approves it. And that means you can just calculate it. This many people got that preventable disease or disorder and then died during those 5 years. So like, you killed those people, FDA. That was you. That's on you. You should think about that. Not just, now there is a downside risk. You should weigh that in, but that shouldn't be the only thing you think about. And so the AstraZeneca thing is another evidence of that risk aversion type stuff. And
well, hey, at least in this case, there is a downside risk to delaying approval, because people are, they're seeing folks around the world getting that jab, going out to spit in each other's mouth parties, et cetera. And they're like, I want to spit in somebody's mouth. I want to cough on my friends. Stop holding this up. Give me that jab ASAP. And also, one thing I've been thinking about, and thinking about this particularly in context to some of the stuff that you've been saying online, Paul, is that, at this point, we now have this global case study of the seeming efficacy with very few downsides of mRNA technology, which hopefully will expedite some of the seemingly, or at least potentially, revolutionary therapeutics that may come out of mRNA in the near future, which, who knows if any of this stuff is actually going to work, but it seems like it's got immense potential. And if it does, that's going to be, that's all part of our sunny 2020s hypothesis.
You strap in, get ready for the booming biotech 20s. Because that's the thing, is that they were already in clinical trials for a carcinoma.
Melanoma, I think.
Melanoma, for a melanoma mRNA-based vaccine. That would basically mean anyone who's at high risk, you have a history of melanomas, you're in an area with lots of direct, near the equator, et cetera. You could get this, and your body would just naturally fight melanoma development, using your own immune system.
Which is incredible.
We could basically get rid of, decrease the incidence of melanomas by a huge percent. And people die of skin cancer, melanomas all the damn time, right? And they were trying it. The early results came out before even COVID were highly promising. It works. And it's still tied up though, because again, average time to vaccine is a decade. And they started those trials, I think, in 2017, 2018, something like that. So the clock's still like 7 years away. It's like, come on, which is why it's so frustrating that right now the Biden administration is talking about who should they appoint as the next acting FDA administrator. And they have their reasons. The industry likes this person, the other likes, but none of them are talking about this question. Like I would have a single question if I was the Senate trying to confirm a nominee. It would be, what are you going to do to make that timeline to mRNA vaccine approval for COVID the norm for all vaccine approval? How can you promise me you'll get us from 10 years to 1 year on average? What are you going to do to accelerate things? Because people are dying, but it's not just melanomas, it's kidney cancer, nephritis, whatever, kidney cancer, prostate cancer. There are mRNA-based vaccines in development for a broad variety, for like dozens of varieties of cancers. I mean, this could literally be, we'll look back at 30 years and it's like, oh yeah, they solved cancer and didn't really realize it until 2020, until the COVID epidemic. Anyways. So
it would be nice if something positive came out of this. But I suppose this is a good segue into I think the larger point. Obviously we did want to talk about our specific immunity, and how we have, thanks to the wonders of modern science, acquired a superpower. Fuck off, COVID! You can't get me, et cetera, et cetera. But the larger point here is that the shot stuff, at least in the US, it's actually going pretty well. I thought that this was just going to be one big fuck up too, but no, it's actually, I keep looking around and I'm like, this is one thing that the US hasn't fucked up. Now, obviously the US is hoarding all of the supplies that are being produced in the US. On the one hand, it's kind of shitty, not very neighborly. But on the other hand, considering that the US does have the world's worst outbreak and seemingly has no plan whatsoever outside of vaccination for containing it, this is the one time where the US behaving in a self-serving fashion is actually somewhat justifiable. And it's probably good for the world if the US gets its outbreak under some semblance of control.
Get our COVID shit together,
Yeah.
Well, and for less than the annual budget of our foreign aid, for less than the annual foreign aid budget, and you probably could just pay for it just using the military aid part. The Biden administration could buy enough vaccine doses to vaccinate the entire world.
Wow.
Right? Like it'd probably be the AstraZeneca one because that's cheaper, because it's easier to make relative to the mRNA one. But that said, I mean, imagine how much, like, I'm pro COVID diplomacy. Let's like just offer, hey, like, here's the thing that we can do that China can't do. And right now, that's the big imperial contest. But we'll, sure, they'll build you some highways as part of the Silk Road, but we will free vaccines for all your people.
Not the Silk Road, Paul. The road and Belt and Road Initiative or whatever.
Yeah. Well, it's like a new Silk Road. I mean, not the dark web.
The new Silk Road, isn't that where you buy drugs online?
Yeah, the dark web. Yeah. But it is. I mean, yeah. So there is a way in which I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. to play this kind of relatively cheap, but leading role. It's good for us as a nation. It's good for the world. It's good for humanity. I mean, it's good for humanity. It's just, so there are, I think, steps that should be taken by the Biden administration, by the government. I do think I'm going to push back on one thing that I see all the time, not from you or anything, but it's annoying me because you can see the first draft of history being written.
Yeah,
and they're getting it so wrong.
I know what you're talking about. I think. Can I guess?
Yeah.
Which is,
tell this version of history for us, Sean.
Yeah. So basically, the version of history that I think you're alluding to, which is, Donald Trump was a fucking idiot, and he was not a very good president. Which, I mean, fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
2 for 2 thus far. But then Joe Biden, he comes into office, an administration of competency. People, adults are back in the room. They know what they're doing. And all of a sudden we see this, it's like a light being switched on, and this competent administration takes the reins of the vaccination program, and heroically, like, Joe's out there just jabbing, like, hey, listen, Mac, let me tell you about this pool back in Wilmington back in 1941. Just jabbing kids while he's telling incoherent stories. Is that what you're alluding to, Paul?
So that's one variation on it. The other, yes, that's one of them. But it's some version of America was struggling, right? Things were bad with the pandemic, and then in came the government. So it can be the Biden administration. That's one wrinkle on it. But the other one is that in came Operation Warp Speed.
Right.
And so Operation Warp, America, it was a shit show. Then the government stepped in with a robust, they pulled out the Defense Production Act and like got the wartime economy, World War II time going, and the government saved America. And now one variation of that is, but still it was a shit show because Donald Trump. So good thing Joe Biden came in. Look at the numbers. Look at the vaccination numbers. Before Biden was inaugurated, they were very low. Now we actually hit 4.5 million shots this weekend, and that's Joe Biden. So that's kind of like a corollary or a wrinkle on that story. And it's a story that's told both by progressives who just kind of reflexively want the state to have an important role in every good thing that happens. It also has a role from like Biden administration stands who do exist. There was one like former like communications director, Dem operative who peddled a version of this on Twitter that I responded to. But also Trumpkins are on board with a version of this. Not the second half, not the Biden's administration of competency, but the first half.
No, but it was all warp speed.
It's all warp speed.
All warp speed that did it. Yeah.
Because that means Donald Trump is responsible for the vaccine. It's like, folks, it's all those things there's a kernel of truth to all of them. Yes, Joe Biden is a better president than Donald Trump. Sure, he clears that low bar, and he does less to get in the way of vaccine rollout than Donald Trump did. He's not actively discouraging people in the way that so that is good. Yes, that's good. And Operation Warp Speed valuable in the supplemental sense, right? Like purchase orders. The main thing here is that the government just said, if you as much vaccine as you make, we will buy. I mean, the U.S. bought 2 times as many doses as it needed by the end of the summer. It didn't have them yet, but that guarantees like, hey, we're going to crank up manufacturing capacity to limit, which they have done. In fact, they're probably over limit, which is why we're getting quality of control issues. Is because the real bottleneck at this point is not the IP, is not the U.S. cultural chauvinism, whatever, our unwillingness to share. It's that like we're at capacity because these are complicated things that require very specialized facilities.
You can't just cook these up on the stovetop.
No, right. It's not meth, unfortunately.
I'm making a stew of messenger RNA today.
That's right. Breaking good. So it valuable supplementary role, but like it just factually is not the main driver of this vaccine or its rollout. These are all complementary, supplementary, secondary considerations, and we know that for a variety of reasons. We now know, I think it was Pfizer BioNTech within 2 days of the genome release had designed an mRNA vaccine. I think it's I think Moderna now, I might have these switched, but Moderna just came out within hours. They had theirs designed because the actual design of it's not the issue. It's the process. It's the creation. That's the hard part. Yeah. And then getting approval is the actual, getting the clinical trials and the FDA approval is the hard part. So they had they had the vaccine.
Yeah.
By January. In January, we had a vaccine. And then everything since then has just been testing and then scaling up manufacturing, which they started to do from the get-go. I mean, I can find article after article back in January, basically Pfizer. I have a coworker whose father is an executive at Pfizer. And back in January, they already were basically pulling off researchers from every other medical line and pouring it all into getting this up and running. Getting the COVID vaccine designed, rolled out, produced, and they we're talking about billions and billions of dollars of capital transfer over to COVID production, development and production, long before. This is January. Operation Warp Speed isn't a glint in Donald Trump's eye, and it didn't come from him until mid-May, and it's not actually doing shit until June, like all those purchase orders and whatnot. That's nearly half a year later.
Yeah.
So if your theory is that, like, you know, America, which is too capitalistic, is failing to deal with the virus and blah, 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 and develop, and then the government came in and is responsible with vaccine, it's just the timeline doesn't fit at all.
Right.
And then the version of this where it's like, now we're, you know, Biden took over, and so competent government means competent vaccine rollout. If you look at the curve of like people being vaccinated, it's a pretty steady curve. It begins very slowly in mid-December, and it's just a pretty steady line of best fit up till today. And that's a good thing. And it's actually great that the government didn't get in the way, but its main role has been to not get in the way.
Yeah.
I mean, the vaccines are produced in private facilities. They are distributed not via the nationalized post office, but via UPS and FedEx by private companies. They are administered primarily not by government entities. So there is some of that. There are some government-run clinics that are doing it, but most of it is being done by Walgreens, and I got mine at Walmart. And so literally every stage in the production and supply and distribution chain is primarily a story of the success of private capacity in the US. And that's a fact. It might be an inconvenient fact, and you can make an argument about why that's still flawed and problematic or whatnot, but like, to just be like, oh, the government did it because Warp Speed and Joe Biden and Donald Trump is ludicrous. And it's now like orthodoxy in some circles. And it's like, no. So anyways, sorry, rant over, Sean.
Well, I mean, you know, this has been, I think that this is, I really feel for more traditional liberals or kind of statist progressives, because I do think that the experience of COVID has just posed a series of inconvenient realities. Because I mean, obviously government has made things worse at a variety of points. Definitely screwed things up, and in a few instances has made things better by stopping screwing up.
Right.
But at least in the US and I would say in Europe as well, insofar as there's been good things happening, it's largely been as a result of private forces. Now, I do think that, you know, if you want to make a kind of statist argument, you can, but you can't really look to the US or Europe, where the state has just bungled virtually every step of this. You have to look to
South Korea,
you know, Taiwan, even though it was heavy-handed. I mean, you know, China has obviously done a good job of containing this. Australia, New Zealand. I mean, there are countries on Earth where the state has done a phenomenal job of basically eradicating COVID without vaccines.
And there really you have a fun argument about, is it worth, I mean, like, because those came with huge costs as well, but we're in the realm of a fun, useful, edifying debate then, right? You know?
Yeah. And I do think that there's something, you know, there's something useful from the level of political economy, in the sense that, you know, while some of these Asian and Pacific countries are more free market, some of them are more command economies, none of them are really neoliberal, in the sense that, you know, you look at a country like South Korea, and sure, you've got huge accumulations of private capital, you know, free market, et cetera, but you haven't seen the diminution of state capacity and the assault on state capacity in the way that you have, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. You know, these are still countries with very robust and active states for the most part. I guess that Australia is kind of the bigger exception there.
Here's where we can have, I mean, this is a productive disagreement, like, but it is a like legitimate disagreement. I mean, you know, it's unlike the other scenarios, but like, I mean, I don't know enough about, frankly, South Korea's, you know, political economy to on those terms. But what I do know, the only, and I frankly don't know much about their vaccination rollout at the moment. I mean, it hasn't been as needed because
Yeah, absolutely.
their caseload has remained quite low.
Right.
But I do know this one fact, which is kind of on the neoliberal side of the ledger, which is they're the ones who, I think we talked about this on an early episode last year. It was the state had failed. Their basically medical regulator and public health authorities had failed so badly during the MERS outbreak several years ago, which didn't hit us, but was a big deal over there and killed a good number of people. And the government so bungled it that the voters took the government down. They overthrew at the next elections, just chucked them all out. So they wanted to avoid those same mistakes. And one of those mistakes was that they tried to do everything in-house which is what we did with COVID. We first attempted this. The FDA said only the CDC is going to develop a COVID test. And they bungled that utterly. And so we never really, even if we had the state capacity to try to track and trace our way to avoid community spread, we couldn't have done it because we didn't have the testing developed and capacity up. So, but in Korea, that's what they had bungled with MERS. And so they said, let's outsource this to the private sector. And so within days, South Korea and America had their first official COVID diagnosed case the same day in January. And within a week, Korea's version of the FDA called in all their pharma companies and said, hey, you all have a free reign if you want emergency use authorization to develop your own test. And let's not put all of our eggs in one basket. And so within basically 2 weeks, there were these tests. And so they were able to test and trace because they relied on private capacity rather than state capacity. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the pandemic, the rest of the current vaccine rollout? I don't know but that's at least another notch from East Asia in the neoliberal ledger is that
Paul's got a little whiteboard and he's just
like, I do. It's I would turn my camera so you can see over here. No, but there is something to be said that like there are, if they say there are no atheists in the foxhole, right? Like. But the flip of that is I think we all, maybe we're not all libertarians, but we're all kind of libertarians in the pandemic or something but I mean, I do think there's a way in which if you're not a state socialist, I mean, because like part of being a political progressive in the United States which is not the same as state socialism, but part of being a progressive means a certain fetishization of the capacity of the state to reasonably, technocratically, rationally regulate markets.
Right.
And of course, the socialist critique of this is that the markets are just going to find a way around. They're going to flow around and there's a public, libertarians will say the same thing. There's, this is where you and I vibe is that rent seeking is going to happen, public choice theory.
Who do you think owns the state?
Right.
Yeah.
And so but progressives almost fetishize and the state and have it in really high regard. And so I think they're struggling with this pandemic. So there are no progressives during the COVID pandemic. It's really been whether or not they acknowledge this or not is another question. But there is even a socialist. Now, the state socialists have a similar problem, which is a certain fetishization of the state as if the state is synonymous with the will of the people.
Well,
right? But not all socialists are state socialists.
Well,
right?
but at least there, I mean, the argument historically has been, I mean, you can trace this back to Marx and Engels as well as Lenin. I mean, there's a long tradition here where it's basically like a socialist state is not the same thing as a bourgeois state. Like the state apparatus takes on the character of the ruling class, whether that ruling class is the bourgeoisie or whether it's the working class. And you can agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, I disagree with that because I think they create their own new. It's just you're swapping out a capital ruling class for a party-based ruling class, and it doesn't actually end up representing the will of the people and leads to atrocities, blah blah. But I think this is the moment for a kind of socialism that you represent, which is a decentralized, not so state dependent, local, community based. Socialism, the socialism of the co-op, the socialism of that's a socialism that can also flourish in the space, which is that rather than there is one big state, whether a bourgeois state or a socialist state that's going to save us from the pandemic. No, we're going to band together through voluntary association, and we're going to be responsible in our communities with how we respond to the pandemic with masking. But we're not going to wait for the state to tell us to mask. We're not going to depend, when Ron DeSantis says it's okay to open businesses, you don't just say, oh, the state said so.
Yeah.
So it's as much an argument for localism, voluntarism, decentralization, whether that is clothed from like a socialist perspective or from a more neoliberal libertarian perspective.
But I'll push back and argue your side from a socialist perspective, which is that this is also, I think the pandemic is a good argument. Sure, there's been valuable mutual aid stuff, and I wouldn't exactly identify myself with the kind of mutual aid tends to be more of an anarchist thing. But I assisted in some mutual aid efforts during COVID, and I do think that some of those things are valuable. Not knocking that. I'm not knocking the kinds of local responses that you're talking about, which I think have you can have effective local responses under capitalism, under socialism. That's really kind of system agnostic. But what I will argue is that this is a very good argument against a kind of like anarchist or extreme libertarian socialist position, which wants to get rid of big entities.
It's true.
Right?
You're right. You're right. Because it doesn't work with anarchism very well at all.
Well, it doesn't work. But I mean, think about like these vaccines were not cooked up in somebody's garage.
No,
right?
They're highly capital intensive. Yeah.
Yes, they're highly capital intensive, and they're developed by these enormous companies that already have huge concentrations of capital and labor at their disposal, and which got in many cases larger concentrations of capital labor at their disposal. So it is a reminder that part of the wonder of modernity and the world that we live in is the fact that we have these big complex institutions.
Yeah.
And the pathway forward for humanity can't be like, well, let's just break them all up and we're just going to have small mom and pop, sort of like that really is more of, I think, sort of an anarchist thing, but but you do occasionally hear stuff like that, and it's like, no, the problem is not the bigness, the problem is how the bigness is administered.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, so you can't go full, like a lot of the where you can kind of get an anarchist approach is how do you get people, you can't wait for people to just do what they're told.
Right.
Like when it came to effectively to social distancing, masking, response to the pandemic. So like there's where they can shine. Like how do you get people to take ownership over their embeddedness in community? How do you get people to take ownership that you're not just an atomized unit, like what your decisions affect your neighbors, affect people you don't even know. Like, so there the kind of voluntarism, localism, whatnot works. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like someone with huge quantities of capital, someone with huge quantities of built up expertise. I mean, and these supply chains, and it's not even just like for the development of the vaccine and it's also the deployment. I mean, these distribution chains, I mean, you remember with the ones we're taking right now, like my Moderna, you got Johnson & Johnson, which doesn't have to be stored as cold.
Right.
It has a longer shelf life. So it's superior in that regard. But the Pfizer, Moderna, they don't actually have to be as cold as they initially thought. But first, they have to be at, like incredibly cold temperatures.
Really freaking
and when
cold.
you take them out of those cold temperatures, they degrade very quickly.
Yes.
Which is a remarkable. Now, we have seen the kind of brittleness of the global supply chain at multiple times through the pandemic. Right. And that's not really the fault of the supply chain per se. It's just that like these are complex, like even something as simple as toilet paper requires all these inputs from dozens of operators across multiple industries spread all over the globe. They're incredibly complex things. Supply chains are amazing. They're just as amazing as any other technology. So,
I just see the ghost of iPencil looming behind you.
It's not wrong though. It's not wrong. I mean, it's true, but it's not wrong. Incredibly complicated. And so when something as disruptive as a pandemic happens, it disrupts the supply chains. And that's everything from toilet paper. Now the shortages on microchips.
Right.
And so that's affecting everything from cars to computers to anyways, all that stuff's going to become a lot more expensive once the current pipeline is. Anyways, it's a whole thing. But contrast that with the distribution supply chain we have globally. I mean, there's obviously Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson from the US. You got AstraZeneca from the UK. You've got the Sinovac from China. You've got the Russian Sputnik. There's a couple of others. I mean, we're talking about globally like a dozen different vaccines being distributed, each of them to hundreds of millions of people by the time this is all done, billions in some cases. That is an incredibly complicated supply chain. A dozen vaccines going to hundreds of millions, even billions of people, some of them, with no central coordinator ultimately, right? Like, again, it's, I mean, not to go all invisible hand on you, but there is something almost magical about the fact that a year ago, they were still trialing this drug, and that now I can go to a rural Walmart in the middle of nowhere, Maine, and I'm getting a vaccine. A year ago, there wasn't the vaccine didn't really exist in production yet. I mean, I guess it technically existed. So go back a little bit farther. A year and 3 months ago, this is a vaccine that didn't exist, using a technology that had never been proved at consumer scale. It requires super sub-zero temperatures. There probably wasn't a freezer in the state of Maine that was cold enough to handle this. Now there's one of those. It has to be administered in a very short time frame. And all those things are clicking a year and 3 months later in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, Maine. So that I can get a dose in my arm, 2 doses ultimately. Like that is a marvel.
It is.
You don't get that from a grocery co-op. Yes, it's
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I do think, and this is, I'm going way down the rabbit hole, and I do think that one thing that we should really talk about at some point is the extent to which the institutions that made this happen are themselves, in many respects, planned economies to varying degrees. You know, the role that effective modern planning can play in making the stuff happen is part of that miracle. But regardless, I think we've got to. I know you're
Sean,
dying inside, Paul.
I'm talking on an empty stomach right now. Don't do this to me.
You don't have breakfast before you record?
Actually, you know, I did. I usually don't, but I did. I had monkey bread this morning, so fittingly,
nice.
Yeah. You know the pull apart monkey bread.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So let's not go down this rabbit hole today. At some point, I really do want to discuss People's Republic of Walmart, because I think that your head will explode. But I think it's a great book.
Love it.
And I think the thing that's so great about it, and we talked about this when we were on Ideas in Progress, is that the book takes the libertarian critique seriously and tries to find a way out of the knowledge problem, you know, and the problems of what happens when you remove the price signal and all that stuff. I'm not saying you would agree with this book, Paul, but I do think that you genuinely like it.
Yeah, I as I get older, I'm less concerned about whether I agree with the thing I encounter and more concerned with whether I find it interesting.
I hear you.
The worst intellectual epithet I can lob these days is if something is boring.
Yes.
Just don't bore me. Don't be routine or
how pedestrian.
Pedestrian. I'm up here in my Ivy Tower just lobbing. I'm so bored.
I do remember us, you know, early on in our friendship, you would just like, the most disdainful thing you could say about somebody was their politics are boring.
I was such a little snit. What a little asshole I was. But yeah, I mean, it's also true.
I mean, you know, I hear you. Yeah. All right. So shots.
Not boring. Speaking of not boring political happenings of the week, how's that for a transition?
There we go. All right. Yeah. So we're done with shots. Now let's talk about Bessemer. So previous episodes, I had stood in steadfast solidarity and sent well wishes to the workers of the Bessemer Amazon distribution center in Alabama in their bid to unionize, and the vote has now been counted, and they did not win. They lost, and they lost pretty big, actually.
It was like a 2/3 margin or something. Like, it's pretty wide.
Yeah, it was pretty wide. It was pretty wide. And I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this. But as somebody in the labor wheelhouse, do you mind if I kind of riff first?
Do a little lament here for us. I mean, it's got to be this.
Yeah,
Sean, I'll say this. Knowing you helped me avoid some of the worst. I don't know. I don't know if my responses to it were necessarily particularly graceful. But it did help me remind me, like, you know what, there's a lot of really disappointed people, and I can sympathize with their disappointment, even if I'm not disappointed by the outcome.
Well, thanks, Paul. I appreciate
that. Do the lament for us first.
Yeah. So obviously, just I would have preferred that they won,
Yeah.
That's the most obvious thing to say. I've seen the amount of energy and effort that goes into a union drive. When SEIU tried to unionize one of our the adjuncts at one of the local community colleges, the lead organizer was a friend of mine, and I have a lot of friends and also folks in SA who work at that college, or I know many of the folks who would have been in the bargaining unit. It's tremendous effort, and whether it works or fails, it's a huge thing. And so I feel for the folks who went through this process. I'm not going to say for nothing, because there's value even in a failed campaign. And I don't think that this will be the end of the unionization efforts at Bessemer writ large, but it just sucks. And but I do think that there's a few valuable lessons here. Jane McAlevey, who's a really great writer and thinker on all things labor and union, has an awesome article in The Nation. I think it's called "The Blowout in Bessemer." And McAlevey basically focuses on three factors that influence the outcome of the vote. And the first is, Amazon's role in defeating the vote. And I think that the thing that McAlevey does that's really smart is that she doesn't stress, the mailbox, for instance, or the specific objections that people had about Amazon's role in this campaign, but rather stressed the totally legal things that employers can do in the United States to beat back unionization drives, which are frankly far more important than the mailbox or the troll armies on Twitter or whatever. Just the fact that when you have a workforce that's unionizing, you can subject them to basically 24-hour mandatory on-site propaganda, et cetera, et cetera. So, she emphasizes that, but I think, a very productive move is really focusing more on the things that the organizers themselves did. And, McAlevey has the street cred to make those arguments as kind of a still relative newcomer to the labor movement. I don't feel appropriate wagging my finger at what they should or could have done. But what I will say is that this is a muscle that the labor movement has not exercised as fully as it should have for many, many decades. And as a result, I think as we build the labor movement, we're going to see a lot of failures before we see successes. And I think we need to just accept that and push forward anyway and not get discouraged. And the other thing is, and this is something that I've directly encountered in my union work, is just the level of internalized fear and apprehension, right? Like, I go to folks who are tenured professors at the University of Florida on a regular basis. And I say to them, hey, not would you be interested in forming a union? Would you be interested in joining a union that already exists? And they'll say, no, I can't. I'm worried about the repercussions. Now, some of that is just, academics are not famed for their level of moral courage. But I do think it speaks to the level of internalized apprehension that people have about participating in the labor movement. in any capacity. And we can talk about whether that's justified or whether that's not justified. I think, at least in my workplace, this idea that if you're a tenured professor, that something bad is going to happen to you because you joined the union, I think that's absurd, frankly. But I hate to be that guy, but your feelings are valid, and I may not agree with where they come from, but hey, you feel that way, and there's a reason that you feel that way, and we've got to address the root causes of that feeling. So if that's the case for a tenured professor who is afraid, and this is a conversation I've had on multiple occasions, who's afraid to join an already existing union, I can totally understand how folks, in far more precarious positions, would be terrified to, vote on a secret ballot when they don't necessarily have confidence that it will actually be secret. So at any rate, I guess my key takeaways here are, let's not get too hung up on the individual fuckery of Amazon in this campaign. I think the structural fuckery is more important. And secondly, let's just not get discouraged. I don't see too many folks getting too discouraged by this result, and I think that's healthy. But for anybody who tunes into Impolitic for your directives on how to approach political life, which good God, I hope nobody does that. I would just say, yeah. I mean, look, we're in a rebuilding phase. The left has been on the back foot for so long that, yeah, we're gonna lose some. The Bernie thing didn't work out. Individual union drives didn't work out. We're gonna lose. It's just gonna happen. The more productive you, sorry to sound like a tech guy, but the more productive you can make those losses, and the more that we can learn from those losses, the more quickly we can move on to the victories. So, take the lessons from this that we can. Let's move on. Hopefully they get a second vote, though, because even, despite what I said, if they can use that mailbox to invalidate the results of the election and get a second crack at this, go for it.
It is remarkable to me. I mean, how much was invested in this case? Like, if you look at the headlines, I posted a tweet where I compared a headline like from 3 days before the vote and after. Someone clearly miscalculated, because the way people were talking about this case was as if it was going to be this is the victory that is going to transform the labor movement. It's going to reverse. It's the beginning of reversing years of so much hope and expectation was invested in this result. And surely someone knew this didn't look like a favorable outcome before the vote.
Sorry to interrupt, but I mean, everybody, basically all of both, folks who have been there that I know, as well as folks whose, informed observers on Twitter that whose takes I saw. I mean, for months now, I don't think that people had a particularly good feeling about where this was going.
It just seems like someone should have been managing expectations a bit, because there was so much hype, pro labor, right. This is gonna do it. Yeah, we're gonna win. We're gonna beat Amazon. It's maybe you should have been tempering, bring down expectations a little bit. Hey, this isn't the only win or lose. There are gonna be other cases, right. But all that managing I didn't see a lot of that reflected in the pro labor news coverage prior to the vote, and then suddenly, which makes the loss that much more crushing.
Yeah.
It is odd to me. It's not obvious to me why Alabama, why choose Alabama for the test case, the big test case against Amazon, right? Why not? Because there's a warehouse in New Jersey, Robbinsville, New Jersey, and New Jersey is a closed shop. It's not a right to work state. It's much more, it has the ratio. It's one of the highest states with per capita union workers still. And there's people there who complain about conditions just as much as there are in Alabama. So why do this in a red state?
Because Paul, you're still thinking about the labor movement as largely a top-down thing. And I keep telling you, that's not actually the way it works. That, these big parent organizations, they mainly just exist to I don't even really know
siphon off cash from
actual honestly, I hate to contribute to to like right-wing talking points, but I genuinely don't know like what these larger parent organizations do for me. The labor movement, insofar as it has vitality, is driven by local actions. And I mean, I don't think anybody chose this as a test case. I think this is just, this is where they were organizing. And it got a lot of attention because, you know, one of the great things that they did, and one of the things that I think is really important for folks to emulate elsewhere, is that there was a significant and serious effort to integrate racial justice demands with labor demands, and really bring BLM into the union drive. And that, I think, you know, the smarter people and more informed people than myself can level informed criticisms about the specific approach. And I strongly encourage everybody to read that Jane McAlevey article. But that is a huge innovation, particularly in majority minority workforces, which is going to be a lot of logistics and frankly, a lot of working class workplaces in general. That's an innovation that, you know, 100% I hope we see elsewhere. So to answer your question, Paul, I don't think anybody chose this. I think this is just, they had an organizing committee. They were making a drive, and this is,
That'll be. I mean, someone will write that history someday. Given how much attention has been on this, we'll get a history of the Bessemer organizing effort. So I mean, a few things here. I mean, I think my first response, like even before the election happened, I had read a couple of pieces because I knew, you know, it's been in the national consciousness because, you know, Biden commented on it. Bernie Sanders went there. I mean, you know, it's Danny Glover went there for that matter. You know, Danny Glover's getting involved. King. You know, it's going to be a successful political effort.
Absolutely. King.
But I saw a number of articles where they went and interviewed workers, both for and against. And even there, it was pretty clear. Without knowing the result, it was clear that there were a lot of workers who simply weren't convinced by the arguments. Some of them had been members of other unions and been like, unions did fuck all for me when I was at UPS or when I was a forklift driver at wherever. And like, hey, around here, $15 an hour this is a place where like the federal minimum wage actually matters because it's Alabama. People are, you know, very low paid jobs, $15 an hour with health benefits and the 401k match. And like, this is the best job around here. So why do we need a union? I mean, so they just weren't convinced. I mean, so it's easy to blame. I think it can be a bad habit to blame the skullduggery of the other side when there's such evidence that just quite simply it got rejected, not primarily because of Amazon's skullduggery, but because the union just didn't prove to enough of the workers that they needed the union.
Right.
Especially when the margin's this wide. We're talking about more than a 2/3 margin. We're talking about nearly 75% margin.
Right.
This is not just some like, oh, they tweaked things and shifted the vote by 5% or something, you know. It's a blowout. And so like, I think it could be a bad habit to fixate on the other side's bad behavior, whether it's real or not. You know, we probably would disagree about the extent. I don't know. I mean, we don't know the facts on the ground, either of us. We just hear accusations from either side that, no, they did this terrible thing. No, they put a mailbox where they shouldn't have. No, so the truth of the matter asserted is kind of inaccessible to us. I was reminded, though, that I read that article, the Nation article that you mentioned, and there was a bit in it which isn't to deny that corporations can do shitty stuff. They can do. I mean, I would be surprised if to find out that a corporation didn't do shitty things. Just as I'm surprised that you know, a union does shitty. I mean, my grandfather got his tires slashed by pro-union activists because they called him a scab.
Right.
And so, you know, I have my own personal inclinations against, you know, or awareness of the potential for skullduggery by everyone involved. And questions about whether anyone involved has the actual best interest of workers at heart. So, but setting those aside, like I read that piece and there was a bit in here that I thought the 19th century historian in you would resonate with. There's this discussion of a book, which is the first I'd heard about it, Confessions of a Union Buster by Martin J. Levitt, published in 1988. And so much of the article hinges on hey, if you doubt that Amazon did bad things, well, read this book. It just shows that corporations always do terrible things. So I don't have to actually, the author never really has to prove that Amazon did anything bad. It just says, look at this book. It shows you that corporations are capable of anything. But if you go and look up the author in the book, he's a shady guy. So he was a union buster, and then he was a pro-union, like he's a grifter. The dude is as much of a grifter as Norman McCorvey was, the titular row,
Right.
who for a while, grifted off of the, I mean, she played both sides of the abortion debate throughout her lifetime, right? Like he's very much like that. And what it reminds me of is those anti-Jesuit conspiracy theories of the 19th century, where you would get someone who was a former nun or a former Jesuit, or at least claimed to be, whether they were or not, and then they would publish a book and go on a speaking tour and rake in some nice cheddar, being like, hey, I'd be in the convent, and the priests would come in and fuck all the nuns, and the nuns all were like lesbians too, and then they would make us do like black masses on the altar, and did you know that I was a Jesuit and my superiors assassinated Abraham Lincoln? And like there was this set of ex-Catholic grifters who grifted off of the mood affiliation of Protestants who were terrified of Catholics, for a successful, career, basically career grifters. And that is what that book reminds me of.
Well,
the author reminds me of.
Two riposte there, Paul.
Okay.
So first of all, I mean, I think the expectation that anybody who is a union buster in the first place is going to be a person of pure motives and pure principle is a high bar. And then, of course, the person who then turns heel is likely to be sort of a double weirdo or a double grifter, but at the same time, like saying that, oh, well, she relies heavily on this book. I think the book is just sort of a shorthand. It's kind
very
of like,
heavily. It's like throughout, she's just like, the unions say Amazon did bad things in this election, and like, I don't know, but like this book says that, how the terrible things corporations do. So I guess they must have. It's it's a linchpin to the article.
I think it's not so much a linchpin as it's a shorthand. It's like when you find you're doing research or you're reporting a story and you find a character or a historical figure or a person who just says exactly what you want to say, or who perfectly embodies a position.
Exactly.
Well, no, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, in a good historical work or a good reported story, there's dozens and dozens of additional pieces of evidence behind that person. They're just the person who expresses that position. I mean, Jane McAlevey has been involved in hundreds and hundreds of union campaigns, even at my very squishy local community college. People experience firsthand all manner of shit that directly echoes the things that this crank and grifter was talking about. So the point is that, sure, like this guy's is a particularly vivid way to exemplify these things, but there's a lot of evidence out there, Paul, that he's not.
Sure. No, I know.
He's not making this stuff up.
I don't think it. I mean, I would be surprised if any corporation union drive had its hands clean. I mean, they're going to do shitty stuff. Both sides have a big incentive to lie and make shit up. It's like, because in so much of it's because the process is so deeply political. I mean, so for the NLRB, it's like, do you really think that the retail workers union would have challenged the mailbox thing if they had won? Well, no, that's because all of this is just, it's the, a union equivalent of red versus blue. And if Amazon had lost, they probably would have challenged their own mailbox. You shouldn't have let us do that.
Yeah.
We have to rerun the election. It's all, both sides just lie and dissemble and do shady stuff because that's the incentives. And there's literally no downside for doing so. Because like, let's say I'm suspicious that the union thing with the mailbox is, maybe I should lay that out in a second, but like, I'm suspicious that it's just, they just need an excuse because they don't like the outcome. and they can't just say we failed to convince workers. They need something that makes them the bad guy. That makes it a failure for that organizing effort. So it's Amazon's fault. We need actually some sort of evidence, a hook for that. The mailbox, it's a tangible thing we can hook on. So it's just an ex post facto excuse, is my suspicion. But like, all of that is incentivized. But let's say it turns out 2 years from now, the NLRB is going to do an investigation. They are, apparently. They're going to do an investigation. It'll come out and there'll be a little line in the back pages of a local newspaper, allegation settled, either for or against who knows about the mailbox, the truth of the matter asserted. It'll be in the back pages of a local newspaper, whereas the allegation is on the front pages of all the major newspapers in America yesterday or 2 days ago, right? And so what's the downside of making shit up? And it could be the union, it could be the corporation. There's basically no downside. Just make shit up, because the national attention only focuses on this for a short window of time. The downsides of lying are minuscule anyways, even if you get caught lying. So I it's always hard with these cases, is because like, I don't, who the fuck is telling the truth? There's no incentive to. So I generally am better off assuming everyone's lying, both Amazon and the union. But like with the mailbox, my take on the mailbox, like I tried to dig in a little bit. Again, it's hard to tell what's just allegation, what's lie. But like, my hypothesis on the mailbox, all those caveats aside, is that Amazon benefits from more people voting. How do we know that? Because they pushed to expand the voting pool. The union initially wanted a smaller voting pool, a more discrete unit, right? And Amazon said, no, it has to be everyone at the workhouse. Like, that's established. That's factually established.
Right.
Amazon successfully pushed the NLRB to include basically almost everyone, every worker at the warehouse, not just a smaller category, which the union pushed for. Why does Amazon want more people to vote? Well, they know that the larger the voting pool, the less important it dilutes the influence of the union over a really highly motivated group. Like, there's probably a group of workers who might be particularly mistreated at the warehouse, who are just very highly motivated. But if you expand it out to the entire pool, it is harder to sustain that kind of intense dissatisfaction of a smaller group. It's kind of like, it is harder as a local organizer, the bigger the voting unit is, right? Like, people are angry. It's easier to get people to do something who are angry about their boss at a company of a few hundred workers versus the mayor of a city of 100,000. It's just harder to push to do social movement organization larger the union. So Amazon benefits from expanding the voting pool as much as possible. The union benefits from keeping that pool as small as possible. We know that's true from the incentives for the number of people voting. We know that from that. I mean, that's kind of established. The mailbox thing comes in later, right? Do we put a USPS drop box right outside Amazon's, the front door to the warehouse or whatever? The union's opposed. Amazon wants it. There's allegations of them kind of like pressuring or pushing the USPS to put it there. It's unclear. I saw some screenshots that were not really, it was hard to tell what was going on, to be frank. But regardless, why do you do that? Well, again, Amazon benefits from kind of like diffident, somewhat apathetic people who aren't really all that invested in the union campaign voting. They want lots of like somewhat apathetic, diffident people voting, not just the highly motivated pro and anti-union folks voting. So making it as easy as possible lowers the barrier to entry for the maximum number of voters, including those who are not highly ideologically motivated, either for or against unionization, to vote. They want to expand the effective size of the franchise in the Bessemer vote. The union wants it as small as possible, again, because it allows them to punch above their numbers, the really more motivated folks that they've created and grassroots enthusiasm among. So, but the irony of this is that if you transpose this into any other electoral system, this would, progressives would be crying foul, because we had a kind of adjacent debate in places like Georgia, where Democrats wanted the franchise as wide as possible. Why? Because there's a large group of traditionally disenfranchised voters, often people, disproportionately people of color, who the higher the barriers are to vote, if you only let them vote on election day, if you make them have voter ID, it scares off disproportionately Democratic voters. So you would make it as easy to vote as possible for as many people to vote as possible. That benefits the Democratic Party. I generally agree with it because I'm pro universal franchise. The Republican Party wants as few people to vote as possible and make it as hard as possible to vote because they benefit from a small number of enthusiastically, racist rural Republicans having outsized disproportionate political power and political voice. So they do what they can to suppress the number of people voting and make it more difficult to vote, while Democrats make it easier to vote and as many people to vote. So it is the exact flip of what was going on in Bessemer. So it is bizarre to me that we would favor, it's just situational. It's just like, it's kind of crass, like the process doesn't matter. It's the outcome we're pushing for that matters. And so, fuck the integrity of the vote and all that. It's just not about democracy. It's about winning. So that's my cynical take on the mailbox and whatnot.
So I would push back on two main things, and then there's another quote from McAlevey that I wanted to emphasize. So I think you're misreading the bargaining unit question. So okay. Paul, there is, speaking as somebody who, so United Faculty of Florida, there's about I think it's about 5,000 faculty members at UF. Only 2,000 of them are represented by my union. That is not an asset for us. That is not even remotely an asset, because when your bargaining unit is not coterminous with the workers in your category of work, what management can do and what they do is they just implement something for the out of unit workers, and then basically whatever they have to bargain is already in place for the out of unit workers, right? So basically, let's say that the management at the University of Florida wants to implement a raise, right? Salary is a mandatory term of bargaining. They have to negotiate it with the union. But because 3/5 of faculty aren't in the bargaining unit, for those 3/5 of faculty, they can just say, here's your raise, done.
Right.
And then that virtually makes it impossible for us to negotiate a higher raise, because then they can say, well, look, this is what we gave to the out of unit faculty. We can't give you something different, right? So my point is that nobody in a union actually sees a smaller bargaining unit as an asset. Maybe it has some very modest benefits in terms of helping you win an election. But then,
then why did the union push for a smaller bargaining unit at Bessemer? I mean, this is a thing they did. They argued before the NLRB against expanding it out.
Because what employers do all the time is that they include in the voting unit, the people who have voting rights, people who have extremely tenuous connections to the workplace, right? And so my guess is that, there are folks in that bargaining, like they were trying to represent maybe full-timers, folks who, put in a consistent 40 hours a week. And what Amazon insisted on was including contractors and part-timers and this and that and the other thing. And the problem with that is that those folks you wouldn't really be able to include them in the contract once you negotiate it. Your bargaining unit should be coterminous with the folks who can be represented by a contract. So, I mean, I see what you're saying, Paul, and I do get it. But what I'm saying is that, like, even if there are benefits on the front end, they evaporate instantaneously. And that, I mean, these folks know that. They know that having a bargaining unit that doesn't actually represent the full group of workers, that just sets you up to get completely fucked later on, and make it basically impossible to actually negotiate a contract.
Yeah, but to worry about that, you have to win the election first. I mean, like, That's all. I mean, makes sense. I mean, I mean, it makes sense to me. What you're saying makes perfect sense.
Right.
But for that to worry about that's a luxury that you get to worry about when you win. If you lose, you don't worry about the relative size of your bargaining unit because
sure.
Your bargaining unit size is 0 at that point.
what I'm saying is that I think we're talking to an extent about apples and oranges, right? Where like what you're describing, the debate in Georgia is basically about, do you live in the United States? If so, and are you a citizen? Then you should have the right to vote easily. What a lot of employers do is like, have you ever worked here? Cool, you're now part of the bargaining unit and you have voting rights. So like if I move to Mozambique and renounce my citizenship, I probably shouldn't be able to vote in U.S. elections anymore. Or yeah, I mean,
felons in Florida.
No, that's not the same thing. Nope. Still citizens of the United States. Yeah, I mean, I get it that you want the vote to be as expansive as possible, but you also want the folks voting to represent the folks who would be affected. And what employers do a lot of times is they try to include folks in the vote who wouldn't actually have any meaningful connection to the union after the vote has taken place.
Okay, so okay, let's just say grant for sake of argument that it's apples and oranges, and so the desire for the size is just some kind of fuckery going on from Amazon. Marginal people are going to be part of this bargaining, the vote pool for a bargaining unit, and blah blah. This doesn't still explain. Okay, it is a really the best argument I saw, or the clearest argument, I mean not best, but the clearest argument I saw for the mailbox was that it was meant to be an act of intimidation. Amazon was intimidating workers by making it easier for them to vote by putting a drop box out in front. This seemed implausible to me. Instead, it was just that, okay, so let's say Amazon does have this idea. We're going to expand out the bargaining unit to include people who are less likely, maybe they're only part-time workers, maybe they're, like you said, more contingent kind of workers, not full-time who are planning on being here for 10 years or something. It's people who are just here for a seasonal labor or that kind of thing, which is a normal thing at Amazon warehouses. Right. They hire a bunch of workers for holidays, for Christmas time, right, and whatnot. And they want to expand out to include those people because they know they're less likely to be interested in a union because they're only going to be here for a little while. Right. So let's just seed that. At the end of the day, though, like, they are still workers at the place. They still, in a workplace democracy, you wouldn't limit the right of voice. Like, so to me, it feels very straightforward. Amazon wants to make it easy for them to vote because they know that will benefit them. They'll get more votes from those people than they will as a proportion of the full timers, the who are more likely to screw pro union. So it's not that they're trying to intimidate them or whatnot. They just want they want folks who are more likely to be favorable to them to vote. Union doesn't want them to vote, not because they don't have a right to a place in workplace democracy, but because they know they're going to more likely to vote for Amazon. Right. Like, I don't see why. To me, this kind of makes both sides look bad, which is effectively neither one really ultimately. This is not about workplace democracy or all the voters feeling heard. We got to win. And then both sides think once we win, we'll do these good things for, downstream from this, we'll do good things for the workers. I'm sure that's what they all tell themselves in the mirror at night. Right. But like, at the end of the day, it's really pretty scuzzy I don't know. I don't see the mailbox as anything other than like both sides just trying to get a political advantage. And
well, I mean, yeah. I think, look, when everybody's playing dirty, if you don't play dirty,
yeah.
No, I mean, seriously,
exactly.
I mean, there's no satisfaction in any long-term sense in refusing to play the game. But what I will say, and I think this is a segue to the second point, which is Amazon has many tools at its disposal to get people to do what it wants. It can hire and fire people. It has money. It has, it owns the Washington Post. It produces, shit for Netflix and Amazon Prime, and I suppose mainly for Amazon Prime.
Yeah, probably not for Netflix so much.
Yeah. Right, like they've got a lot of levers at their disposal, and sure, having some credibility in the eyes of the public is probably important to them. But at the end of the day, they don't really need that. as long as they continue getting your goodies to your front door quickly and pumping out good content for Amazon Prime, they're going to be okay. On the union side, credibility is basically the only thing that you have, because what money your dues generate, oftentimes, and again, if you're anti-union, don't listen to what I'm about to say. Shit, if I know where most of my dues go, I assume just to Democratic politicians uh, who absolutely suck. Yeah, I mean, your credibility in the eyes of your colleagues, that's what you got. And if you start just bullshitting them about everything, they're not going to believe you. And we already see in this country, not just the impact of anti-union, anti-labor propaganda and agitation. We see also two extremely pernicious ideas that union organizers, whether you already have a union or whether you want one, have to come up against. And one of them is, the failures of the labor movement in the past, right? Like that guy that you alluded to who said, well, I've been in a union before and it sucked. Guess what? He's probably right. A lot of unions out there completely fucking suck. And we do have to deal with that, and that is an obstacle that we have to overcome in any organizing situation. The other thing is that we have such a lack of a solidaristic mindset in the United States that people think of the union, and this is something that McAlevey talks about in the article, as this institution out there, right? The union is them. It's these other people. It's this building on the corner. And this is something that in my union, we come up against this every damn day. And it's like, no, you are the union. The union is the expression of our collective power as workers. And insofar as it becomes this institution outside of us, that's how far the movement has failed, right? And so when you start lying, when you start acting as if there's this interest beyond the interests of individual workers coming together for the collective good, you don't have shit. You don't have anything, right? So I would say, is there opportunistic messaging around the mailbox? Maybe, I don't know. I think a lot of people's concerns is that, they thought that Amazon that this mailbox was basically a trash can, a glorified trash can, or that Amazon was viewing, that they were surveilling who was putting stuff in. But whether or not there's opportunistic messaging around that, and I can't blame them if there is. I mean, who wouldn't want to get a second crack at that vote? I would. Shit, I definitely would.
Right. Oh yeah, I understand that. If I was running the whatever the local unit of the SWSDU, whatever they are, I'd make the same argument. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm sure there's, it's if you're a lawyer, you have an obligation to try to get your client off.
Right.
Or to try to put them in jail. Your primary obligation is not to some abstract notion of truth or justice. It's
right.
An adversarial system. We created an adversarial system in labor organization like we did in our court system. And the point of an adversarial system is not for disinterested parties to try to explore the truth together.
Yeah.
It's to lie, beg, cheat, and steal their way to winning.
But I mean, the larger point is whatever's happening around the mailbox. And again, I'm not on the ground. I can't speak to that. There is, from the union side, a tremendous downside to lying about more fundamental things.
Yeah.
Because that's all you got.
Does this make it? I'm sorry. Does this make it a mistake to focus? Because like so much of Bessemer became a national story. It was like national figures parachuting in. Do you think they would have been better off that in general, union drives are better off if they keep it local? Like this is about us. It's not about the Biden administration in DC. It's not about Danny Glover in California. It's not about Bernie Sanders, up in wherever. This is about you, the workers. This is a local story. We're going to do you think the nationalization of these union struggles is a net negative?
Yeah, I would probably say yes. I think that the nationalization of these struggles has two big downsides.
Because it does that othering thing you're talking about. Like then it's about something other than like at my warehouse, I'm mistreated.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it does two main things. One is it inevitably lends a partisan cast to this. And, this doesn't really apply in my union because virtually all professors are Democrats of one stripe or another. Um, uh, but, in other parts of the South, you're going to get pro-union folks who are also Republicans. That's just the nature of the beast. And when you make it this national story, and I'm not criticizing, like, I'm really glad that Bernie actually showed some solidarity. But the problem is that, whenever you make a story national in a modern context, it's going to take on a partisan cast. And whenever it takes on a partisan cast, people are going to view it through that lens, right? And so it no longer becomes, do I want a union or do I not want a union? It becomes, do I like this thing that Joe Biden also likes? Mm-hmm. Or do I like this thing that, Matt Gaetz doesn't like? Right. So I think that's one casualty. And the other thing is that, we have no attention span as a society. And when you make something a national story, I think it exerts greater pressure on the timeline. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, and we see this again and again, and McAlevey alludes to it, and I get where this impulse comes from, but virtually all of these union struggles that we see that fail, they fail because they haven't done the work to build up the spirit of solidarity, right? Yeah. To give people courage. And particularly in the South, we just have to acknowledge the fact that there is a default and ambient anti-union atmosphere, right? Like that's the air that everybody breathes. Most people sort of grow up with that in this part of the country. Yeah. And if you're going to overcome that, you've got to work on people for a long, long, long time. In my union, I know Ellen personally. I mean, there are folks that she's worked on for months and months and months. And eventually, maybe they come around because you say something that really finally breaks through or that really helps them see the value or credibility of a union. But if you're trying to do this on a tight time frame, which inevitably a national contest does, then that's going to limit your results. And it also means that you spend more time feting the Danny Glovers and the Bernie Sanders and doing media hits and things like that. You spend more time doing that and less time doing extremely unsexy work, like going to people's houses and just saying, hey, can I talk to you for 30 minutes about this union?
Yeah. And most of that's not going to be on the local union effort. Like, it's not like the local union said, hey, Bernie, would you give us your word of support? Some right. media figure said, hey, Bernie, we know you like unions. Union down. What do you think about it? And like, right. What's Bernie going to say? No comment, No, he's going to. So like a lot of it's not driven by the local union effort right. itself. It's driven by forces beyond their control. So that's not me attempting to criticize that union. I just think on a meta level, is this good or bad for union efforts to,
all this stuff is just, it's infuriatingly slow. It is such a painful, gradual process of just winning people over conversation by conversation. And for a society that has no appetite for that kind of work, like that sounds like shit. That does not sound fun or appealing, but I don't think that there's any other way.
Yeah. No, that's a good note. I'll add to this. I think Bessemer, there's several things about it that strike me. It gets back to a conversation we have had repeatedly about the failures of the NLRB system and the ways in which at first folks thought the Wagner Act was just like a boon for unions, but pretty quickly it has since become more and more apparent that the NLRB system is as much a gift to corporations as it is to unions. And the balance of power there within the NLRB system has arguably shifted over time. But like how different this story could be if it weren't for the NLRB. Like NLRB sucks. And I think Bessemer shows that. It sucks, and it sucks so bad that I think unionization would have been better if the NLRB didn't exist at all. So for a few things. First of all, like my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, you know the nitty-gritty of organization in a way that I don't. But my impression, so one of the things folks mentioned, and this was somewhat contradictory, which some folks said if we had only had the PRO Act and card check early on, we would have won because people would have filed for the union and would have won without all this, the Amazon's opportunity to like build up its response to gear up. We would have just won quick and dirty, and would have, other folks said, well, if only fewer people had voted at the beginning until we had a chance for the national like unionization campaign to start, then we would have won. These are contradictory impulses, and I get it. Folks are just trying to find a reason. But the card check thing had me thinking, which is that in a non-NLRB system, a card check is an attempt to get closer to pre-NLRB. When to unionize, you know what? All it took to unionize before the Wagner Act was just a group of people at a workplace saying, I want to be part of a union. And magically, they were part of a union. You didn't need to get the government to approve your union, to approve your effort. You just unionized. Like 2 people at a workplace could form a union chapter. You didn't need some percentage. You didn't need to go through a whole process that takes years to organize. You don't need to argue about what size is the bargaining and voting pool and bargaining unit. No, 2 people, bam, you got a union chapter at your workplace. And then, so this idea that you only get to form a union if the NLRB says so is utterly bizarre to me. Utterly bizarre. That is some bullshit. Okay. Now, what's also, so it is like, that's not pro-union, right? Like unions should just be able to voluntarily organize. Now, we've talked about the other component of this, which is that like, we talked about the importance of not lying for unionization and whatnot. Well, unions should be able to, compete. Like maybe, I don't know the particulars of this case, but maybe the workers weren't convinced by the case made for unionization by the SW, whatever, I forget their name now, but the local unit tried to represent them. But maybe another union effort from a different union would be more persuasive for whatever reason. Like it shouldn't all come down to there's this like one approach. This is your choice. It's either you're for Amazon or you're for this one very specific union. And if you choose for them, you're locked in with them for perpetuity, basically. The number of units that switch from one union to another is vanishingly small, so it's functionally impossible. That's it. You're locked in permanently. That's bizarre too. There should be, I would say in an ideal world, Bessemer would have multiple unions already right now at this moment. Fuck the NLRB. There would be multiple unions representing workers. Those unions would probably be working together in solidarity to put pressure on the, right? Like, and so there would be unions right now. Fuck the vote. Those unions would be putting pressure on Amazon by saying, hey, I've got 30 workers as part of my union. They've got 200 workers. They got 500 over there. And you know what? We have put together our differences on approach right now, and we're all going to do a wildcat strike, which in my ideal system is just called a strike. No wildcat, it's just a strike. We're going to strike unless you let us have bathroom breaks. We don't have to pee in bottles anymore or whatever. But all of that right now is bureaucratized, routinized. You don't get a union unless the government says it's okay. The government doesn't say it's okay unless you go through this long, lengthy, onerous voting process that the corporation gets input into. And then once you do have your union, you can't ever switch out of it. They can lie and spend your dues however they want, and you know fuck all about what they do with it. But tough luck. That it is what it is. And then when it comes time to strike, you got to get permission to strike only at certain times from this government agency. That is a bullshit system. What the fuck? Like, so like rather than being annoyed that unions lost in Bessemer, be annoyed that you had to go through this process at Bessemer at all. Your enemy, the ultimate enemy of labor unionism is not Amazon today. It is not Walmart in the 90s. Remember how Walmart used to play the role of Amazon? And now that feels so quaint 30 years on.
Which is weird because it's still a huge company.
It is, yeah, but it does. It feels very, like that used to be the big bad heavy. So the big bad's heavy cycle through every decade or so. they're not the ultimate enemy. The ultimate enemy of honest, productive, representative worker democracy promoting labor unionism is the NLRB system. Period. And to me, Bessemer is another reminder of that.
I mean, I'm on board with a lot of that. I mean, I think the simple counterpoint would be that the NLRB, it imposes these annoying and burdensome requirements because once you have the union, you have exclusive rights of representation, and the employer ostensibly has to bargain with you.
Right, it's a closed shop, and then there's benefits that flow from that, and
right.
Yeah.
But the thing is that in point of fact, even once bargaining units form unions, that doesn't mean that you can actually get the management to the table to bargain with you, and you oftentimes have to force that, not through legal processes but through collective action, which you could ostensibly do without this legal straitjacket. You could just get a bunch of people really pissed off and say, negotiate with us, asshole.
Yeah, you don't have to wait for this. Like, there's a particular window when you're allowed to
right. Yeah, and the flip side of that is, okay, I mean, fine, like, my unit, I have a minority unit, in the sense that we our density in our bargaining unit is only about 40%. So 60% of the bargaining unit, non-members of the union, because it's right to work, they pay no dues, et cetera, et cetera. 40% is, they are members. But the thing is that when you only have 40% members in your unit, and when your unit only represents 2/5 of the workers in your category, management basically just says, like, fuck off to you anyway. So even though they come to the table with us, it's not like it's not like that's a neutral process where they're just like, oh, that's a good idea, thanks.
Yeah.
So I do think that it, like a lot of New Deal stuff, it imposed an order on a process. It attempted to impose an order on a process that by its very nature is chaotic, and requires and contains confrontation and contradiction. And in some ways it does successfully manage and contain that process, but not necessarily in ways that are beneficial for really anybody, and certainly not in the case of the NLRB system for labor. So it would be nice if people could just be like, hey, we 4 people, we're the union, and if you want to join us, cool, we're happy to have you. And in point of fact, that is really, like, when people talk about organizers always talk about, like, you need to have a union before you have a union, right? Your union needs to be exist in fact before it exists in law, and that's really what they're pointing to, which is, you create an organizing committee, you get your list, you start knocking on doors, you start talking to people, and you develop that credibility and that connection long before you ever pull cards, long before you ever have the election, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, I think there's something to it, Paul.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep pounding away at this until someday, it's not going to be anytime soon, I don't think. Right now it's still proact this and cards like that. I am reminded of another conversation we've had, which is, I put on here SEIU better than AFL-CIO. And again, this is the big parent, national organization. What the fuck do they do? It's the local unions that do the shit. But there is, we talked about this at one point, the SEIU proposal was to reimagine unionization for a new style economy. Because so the NLRB, the Wagner Act, is a product of an industrialized America.
Right.
When you have these factories for big companies that are going to exist for your entire work life, and you're going to work on this factory line your entire life, it's a very stable, there's not lots of labor turnover or movement, not a lot of social mobility either, for that matter. So it's a very stable kind of environment. And we designed our system, everything about our labor system, both organized labor, both benefits for labor, our tax structure for wages and benefits. All that is designed around we're going to be an industrial society in perpetuity. And we aren't. Like, the workplace economy is very different. And the AFL-CIO seems determined to keep trying to get us back to a New Deal style system, 8 to 5 work, guarantee, full-time, only, full-time jobs, privileged over part-time jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's their nostalgia for the New Deal era is keeping them from imagining something new. The SEIU, I think because they're newer, has less of that. So the SEIU had that proposal that, I think we talked about at one point where they were going to create portable benefits, that rather than AFL-CIO wants benefits to either be provided, if it's not by the employer, it's going to be provided by the union. The problem is you ever leave that place that's organized by that union, you could lose your benefits, just as if you leave your employer. So it's not great for workers. It locks them into a particular place. That's okay in the system where you work at the same place for 40 years, your whole career. Not okay in a much more mobile economy today. The SAU said, hey, the reality is people are going to be bouncing between jobs. They shouldn't lose their benefits. So rather than locking them into a particular, this union organized workplace, this employer, they should be portable. The union is going to negotiate that every unionized employee, this percentage of their, whatever salary has to be matched by the employer. It goes into a pool for retire. Every worker has to have a employer matched retirement plan that's portable with them wherever they go. Employer paid for healthcare benefits that go with them wherever they go. Like, the SAU is thinking about the new economy, and the AFL-CIO is not. And the problem is Bessemer is a new economy type place. Like, you can see that in the number of most of those vote challenges, my understanding is, I think there were 500 vote challenges from Amazon Union, were workers who no longer work there. So they voted, but now they don't work there. There's huge turnover. This is like a gig economy place. It's people who go, and actually some of the folks that were interviewed in the interviews I read, they said, like, look, this is great work. I'm going to work here for 2 years while I finish my GED or while I transition to somewhere else. I'm just raising capital. Like, they're not thinking I'm going to be here for 40 years. And so they're not going to be interested in a traditional 1930s style union effort, which is what the AFL-CIO offered them. But imagine if instead it was join the union so that you get a guaranteed we're going to raise the amount that goes into your portable pot of retirement healthcare benefits that are going to go with you when you leave the Amazon warehouse in 2 years, wherever you go. The union is interested in you for life, not just for here for 6 months or 2 years. Like, some radical re-envisioning is going on at places like the SEIU that's not going on at AFL-CIO. And I think that was the mistake, is applying that old model to a new model economy in Bessemer, Alabama.
Yeah, and the PRO Act would certainly help in the sense that, it would allow workers to organize more easily and avoid some of these issues with a very transient workforce who are hard to organize, et cetera, et cetera. But it wouldn't address the benefits issue and that point. Though I want to wrap up, not just because we're going long, but also because we've got a pretty heady storm over here, and I don't want to lose power.
Yeah.
But I will say,
Sean, you can just tell us if there's another Formula One race.
No, we're off this weekend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I did get some from one of our listeners. I did get some inside information about some of the things that we've been talking about.
Cool.
But I will communicate that offline, Paul.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe next time we can touch on the topic.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
Oh, and actually what we should do, Sean, maybe we should do a I have HBO Max at the moment, so that what's that one, the Ford v Ferrari movie? Maybe we should watch. That should be our next, In Politics Goes to the Movies, and we can do a little bit for the regular show and a little bit for our Patreon subscribers.
I would be down with that, though. I think it's going to take some convincing to get Elaine to watch it. But usually, if I say, "Hey, it's for the show," she's like, "Oh, well, shoot, we got to do it."
It's for the show, and they're hot actors. Who is it? It's like Christian Bale and Matt
Damon. I don't think those are really her taste.
That's not her taste, though.
Yeah. My friend, my friend and coworker, he said the movie is very boring, but it has cool cars and cool watches.
Okay. Well, just add to that: cool cars, cool watches, and some Real Housewives. And bam.
There we go. Oh, and Paul, this would make this. So we watched 4 movies for the show. As far as I recall, there's no real watch content in It's a Wonderful Life. I also don't really recall watch content in Lethal Weapon, but in Death Wish, that like watches were a central feature of that
movie. Are you a watch guy, Sean? Are you? I've never really been a big watch person.
No, I really like Citizen watches, which it's like the lowest of even they're not high end. They're like the top of the low end, I guess I would say. And the reason why I like them is because they're solar powered, and so you never ever have to replace the battery, right? So like whatever you pay, and they're also unbreakable. Huh? They're like built. I have no idea how this company's in business, because they just build their products like tanks, and then you never have to do any maintenance on them. You never have to buy anything to support them. So
well, there is that like watch marketing where it's like, you want this so that you can pass it on to the next generation, usually expressed in male gendered terms. But like that's such a, I don't know if that's Citizen, but someone else.
No,
those other companies. You're buying a legacy. You're not just buying a watch, which I guess you have to do in the age of like smartphones. You can't. This isn't primarily about timekeeping. It's about something else, because we all have timekeeping devices on us anyways.
Yeah, the thing I always find funny about that is it just sort of assumes that taste will never change, which I always think is amazing, because like men's watches, the face used to be like the size of a dime, and now the face is like the size of a hubcap. Yeah,
there's probably something there, like, you know how like the trucks. So, you know, the trucks have been getting bigger and bigger. But there's like structural incentives that encourage that, and yada yada. But the other thing that's gotten bigger from a design standpoint, I read this interesting article on like Jalopnik or something, where the grill have gotten bigger. Like they look like massive like mouths now, and they actually aren't functional. Like the size of the air intake is as large as it needs to be. They just make the radiator's
only like a fraction of
They make the grill that big because it like looks intimidating, and like there's like all kinds of like toxic masculinity tied up into it. So I imagine might be an element of that too, with like, my watch is big, you know, like it's like my dick. I don't know.
Well, you joke, but there's this great podcast that I've been listening to recently called Low Culture Boil, and they basically do, it's sort of like an exploration of weird and crappy culture from our childhood and young adulthood. It's like all basically an exploration of the culture of the aughts. And they had a great episode on pickup PUA, like pickup artist stuff. And the giant watch faces, that was apparently part of like pickup artist thing. So you'd go talk to somebody in an incredibly creepy and offensive way, and your watch would be so big that they had to talk about it.
I mean, is this not like Flava Flav with the like, just forget the watch on the wrist, just wait? Isn't it Flava Flav who wore the big?
Well, like one of the, apparently I knew to my credit, even though I had some scuzzy moments in my my younger days. To my credit, I knew nothing, was never interested in this PUA shit. But like one of the leading figures, as I discovered from this podcast, I think some guy called like Magic or Magician or whatever, I don't know, some asshole. His like gimmick to get women to talk to him was to wear like bowlers and top hats that were furry.
Yes.
Like, hey baby, want to talk about my ermine top hat?
Oh, is this that thing? Is this peacocking? Is that what that is?
That's peacocking.
Okay. I know the term. I don't really, I guess you're just trying to draw attention by whatever means necessary, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even negative attention is good attention or something. I don't know.
Yeah. P.T. Barnum. There's no such thing as bad publicity.
Yeah. Oh man. He's still with us in spirit.
P.T. Barnum?
Yeah. We'll just blame him for pickup artists too.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah. he I'll have to think about what P.T. Barnum's attitude towards pickup artists would have been, but whatever. All right, Paul, we are digressing. We're definitely regressing and digressing. So let's bring this to a close. Hopefully, we were experimenting. We've talked it up on the past 2 episodes, and it didn't work out. But we're hopeful that this time, Impolitic, the TV show, Impolitic, the YouTube experience, has now actually worked out. And maybe you can actually watch us, on YouTube as well as listen to us on your podcast program of choice. But if it didn't work out, we're sorry. If you are watching, great. Thanks as always for tuning in. And until next time, be well.